Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our weekly AJA session. Tonight, we are very privileged to have Yonah Jeremy Bob, who is the Jerusalem Post senior military correspondent, intelligence analyst, and literary editor. So we're very, very privileged to have him on tonight. My name's Tennille. I've recently joined the AJA. Some of you might have met me at the end of last year. I am the community engagement director. So I'm very pleased to meet a lot of you in this coming year and be working with the AJA. Tonight, we're discussing something very important. We are having an update with Yonah, which is going to be about Israel's military challenges in Gaza, the Lebanese border, and from Iran. Something that I know we've all been following very closely online, on social media, in the news, but it's incredible that we have an expert such as yourself here tonight to really run us through the nitty-gritty, give us the insider details. So thank you very much for joining us, and to everyone, please enjoy.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, and I still do hope to visit Australia physically at some point, but it's great to speak to everybody virtually. I just I'm going to be talking the first half really, 100% about the Gaza war and Hezbollah and the Houthis and everything that's going on. I call them all of Iran's proxies. And the second half is going to be more specifically about Iran. I did recently come out with a book called Target Tehran. I sent Robert a link to it if he's able to put that in the chat or whatever for people to see afterwards. Besides being on the Wall Street Journal's top 5 list for politics for 2023, I'm going to talk a little bit about some main points in the book because the book just came out a few months ago and it's even more relevant today than it was when it first came out. But let's start with Gaza. And when I talk about Gaza, aside from being at the Jerusalem Post for about 12 years and having worked for about 5 years in different Israeli government and military legal positions, particularly international related positions where I had a lot of vantage point on various, top secret things that were going on. I've been in Gaza twice, embedded with troops during the war, both in northern Gaza at Shifa Hospital. People who know the issue well know that Shifa Hospital is one of Hamas's top headquarters in northern Gaza. There's a number of hospitals that they've, systematically used against Israel and for terrorism, but Shifa was like the major hospital they've been using for well over a decade. I was also in Khan Yunis, that's sort of the Hamas, capital of southern Gaza, next to one of Yahya Sinwar, right? He's the chief of Hamas in Gaza, one of his houses that was turned into a crater. So I've been, on the front. Besides that, I've been, to the southern front. I don't even know how many times, lots and lots of times with different Israeli military, exercises or briefings, and I've been to the north 3 times. So that's a little bit about what I'm giving you. Where we are now, look, I want to say a minute or two about the intelligence failure that led to this on October 7th, but then move on because what's most important is what's coming. People in question and answer, if you want to feel free to ask more. I've talked about, given a 30-minute talk on the tactical failures. I can talk about that in more depth, but the big thing was the imagination failure. Okay, we just didn't take Hamas seriously. Israel saw Hamas as the weakest of all Iran's proxies, right? Iran is the major threat and sort of the one sort of pulling the strings. After Iran, by far, Hezbollah in Lebanon is the next most major threat. And then there were various threats that Israel was worried about in Syria from Iranian proxies there. Hamas was really at the bottom of the totem pole, just not considered serious. And it was a mistake. And because of that, Israel didn't take it seriously. There weren't enough troops on the border. There weren't enough redundancies. If Hamas tried to do what it did in terms of attacking Israeli sensors and Israeli technology that was supposed to give, early warning, And it's not like Israel needed to have 100,000 or 450,000 troops on the border. And we know, because all the reserves caught up, that Israel had 460,000 troops in the entire army with all the reserves. They probably needed like 1,000 or 1,500. That probably would have been enough to stop all or most of what happened on October 7th. So it was really just not taking Hamas seriously, not imagining that they could pull off what they pulled off. After that, again, there were numerous tactical failures. If anybody asks about it in question and answer, I'm happy to talk about it. So what happened after that? Israel invades, Israel repels Hamas after about 3 or 4 days. Israel invades northern Gaza a couple weeks later at the end of October. By mid-November, Israel basically has control over most of northern Gaza, other than Jabalia and Shijaya. By about mid-December, Israel also has control of Jabalia and Shijaya. Certainly by early January, Israel has what they call operational effective control of all of northern Gaza. That includes the majority of Hamas's forces, terrorists, whatever you want to call them. They have 24 battalions. The majority of them were in northern Gaza. So the majority of Hamas's forces already by early January are taken apart. In southern Gaza, the invasion only started in early December. People forget about that Israel did this in like a multiple phase invasion. It could have, by the way, and I think it might have been smarter to invade northern and southern Gaza and central Gaza all at the same time. But there were various reasons. Again, I can elaborate if anybody wants to ask and question and answer. Complicated strategic reasons why they thought it made sense to do it in multiple shifts. So they invade southern Gaza and Khan Yunis only in early December, and they make really fast progress for the first 2 weeks, and then they get stuck. And if you started to follow my articles or anybody else in sort of late December, early mid-January, not a lot was happening. If the IDF was able to kill 6,000, 7,000 Hamas forces terrorists in the first month or so, you had about a month where you were hearing about, oh, the IDF killed 5 terrorists here, 10 terrorists there. That's not a lot. So the pace of progress was much slower. And then, if you follow me and some other people, about a week and a half ago, there was a new push in the western part of Khan Yunis, and that was maybe a decisive moment. Again, the original push in Khan Yunis was successful, but they sort of got stuck. And that second push seems to have decided the Battle of Khan Yunis, so to speak. There was, some key, sort of a, backup defensive line that Hamas had managed to put together there. Also in their underground, right? We know that this war is, there have been wars with underground before, but this war is probably the most in terms of simultaneously having to fight above and underground, the extent of the underground that Hamas has. So it was even more extensive in Khan Yunis than anywhere else. And so what I was told just a few days ago is that for the first time ever, a modern military was fighting above and underground simultaneously at the same speed and the same levels, meaning we weren't sending 1 or 2 soldiers into the holes, into the tunnel shafts. We were sending full platoons into the tunnels, fighting underground in large battles, the same way they were above ground, all at the same time. That's revolutionary in terms of sort of new military doctrine, new military tactical abilities. Some of that, frankly, the officer who was briefing me and a few others said wouldn't have even have been possible at the beginning of the war. Israel had not spent enough time fighting in tunnels. We'd blown tunnels up before, but actually going into long tunnels that go on for kilometers and have not just a couple of hiding some weapons, but extensive communication centers and places to hold the hostages. I don't know if people saw the pictures of the cages. They had a huge room with cages to hold hostages. So this was something that Israel had not dealt with before. And so at the beginning of the war, knowing it was one thing to know how to blow up a tunnel by throwing some bombs and explosives or airstrikes in. It's another thing to know how to maneuver large forces through underground tunnels. That's new just really in the last week and a half. Even in northern Gaza, they weren't doing it to that extent. So that's the good news, is probably in the coming days, in the coming weeks, both northern Gaza and southern Gaza will basically be in operational effective control of the IDF. That's the good news. The other good news, the rockets are down. They're not gone. But if, at the beginning, the first day of the war, there were something like 5,000 rockets. And after that, there were hundreds of rockets every day per day. Rockets on Tel Aviv basically every day, multiple times for the first 2 months. That dropped eventually to 50 to 70 rockets. It dropped eventually to a couple dozen rockets per day. We're now talking about sometimes days where there are no rockets at all. Most days there's a rocket or two only shot nearby the south, not at the Tel Aviv central area. There was one instance this week. Before that, the last time there was 3 weeks that Tel Aviv or the central Israel was any rocket attacks. And again, none of these rockets are hitting anyone. So that's all of the good news. All right, the not good news or the complicated news is we don't have most of the hostages. All right, we got 81 hostages back. Some hostages have also been killed. So there's somewhere between probably 100 to 110 living hostages, and we have not succeeded in rescue operations to get them back. There's only been one successful rescue operation of a live hostage, Uri Megidish, near the beginning of the invasion. Hamas learned from that. We've not been able to get most of the hostages. We have taken apart most of Hamas's battalions. We have either killed or immobilized or arrested probably around 50 to 60% of their forces. We have not gotten a single member of their high command. Again, I mentioned Yahya Sinwar. He's sort of the civilian chief. Then you have Mohammed Deif. He's the military chief. And then you've got Sinwar's brother, Muhammad. We got two Muhammads, and Marwan Isa. These are sort of like the 4 people who are talked about the most. We haven't gotten any of them or the hostages, even though we're now closing in on 4 months into the war, a little bit over 3 months of the invasion, and that's disconcerting and it's worrying. And it's so people start to say, will we actually be able to get them? Or is the only way to get them is basically through some sort of negotiation, some sort of deal? If so, what are the terms of that deal? At the beginning, the terms of the deal were going to be just temporary ceasefire, and some Palestinian security prisoners get freed for the hostages. I can tell you that the polls have moved, and now the debate is basically if Israel can get all the hostages back. So people who are sort of harder core about getting rid of Hamas will say that they will tolerate a deal where the top leaders of Hamas get expelled and are sent to Qatar or some other place like that, but they get to live. Right at the beginning of the war, people were saying, Sinwar is a dead man, Deif is a dead man. You won't hear people saying that as much anymore. You haven't heard people saying that in a while. So even I'd say the people who are harder core in the government about destroying Hamas, the idea is some sort of a deal where a bunch of Palestinian prisoners, security prisoners, would be released for the hostages, and the leadership of Hamas would be expelled but get to live. That's sort of like the people who are harder core about destroying Hamas. There are top people in the war cabinet. Gadi Eisenkot, he's a former IDF chief, has gone public about it, that he's basically willing to get, in order to get all the hostages back, he's willing to sort of end the war where it is, and at least temporarily allow the Hamas leadership to remain in Gaza. How does he explain that? He would say, well, look, at some point, whatever ceasefire deal is made, they'll violate it, and then we can kill them at that later point. The IDF could kill them at that point. So that's sort of the debate about that. Now, all of this gets even more complicated because whatever you do with the Hamas leadership, you then have, let's say even if they were killed, in the best case scenario, let's say tomorrow somebody pulled off an amazing Entebbe style operation, all the hostages are rescued and all the Hamas leadership is killed. And I've been told by special operations people that it's not possible because they're underground. They can't achieve surprise the same way that they could above ground at Entebbe. But let's say that happened, you'd still have 40% of Hamas faded into the population, waiting to try to come back, waiting to wage a guerrilla-style insurgency, low-intensity conflict war. They could easily go on. The initial estimates were at least 9 months, and that was the best case. So it could go on for a year. It could go on for a year and a half. So that's something that we have to deal with afterwards, no matter what. And if we manage to beat that low intensity conflict, after 9 months or a year and a half, we've, gotten rid of enough of them, or they decide to sort of give up because they see that we're not going anywhere. Then we have what's called the day after. We need to hand Gaza over to somebody else. Israel does not, nobody who's making decisions anyway in the Israeli government wants to hold on to Gaza. They want to hand it over. Who do you hand it over to? And nobody has a perfect solution to this. All of the options are sort of picking among the least bad options, so to speak, from a number of bad options. It's usually some sort of hybrid that people talk about. So, okay, some group of local Gazans who aren't associated with Hamas. You might ask, who from Gaza isn't associated with Hamas? So some group of local Gazans who are less associated with Hamas, let's say at least they haven't fought with Hamas. Maybe if they were, did administrative things, but they haven't been a Hamas fighter at least. They're not that committed. They're not that religious, so to speak. So some of them, most of the world wants some aspect of the Palestinian Authority from the West Bank, right? That's the Fatah's more secular Palestinians from the West Bank to be involved also. Parts of the Israeli government are okay with that. The opposition in Israel is okay with that. Netanyahu, to date, has said he's not okay with that. But we'll see. There have been leaks that maybe he would be okay with that in certain circumstances. So they might be in the picture. And then there's this idea of Israel's Arab allies, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, maybe Saudi Arabia, if all of the stars align, right? Because those other countries I mentioned were part of the Abraham Accords, have already normalized with Israel. Saudi Arabia hasn't yet. So all of those countries would maybe be somehow involved in helping manage Gaza, partially on the sort of the civilian management front, partially maybe also providing peacekeepers, maybe also the United States and some group of Western countries, including some European countries, maybe even Australia, maybe contribute some peacekeepers and some help in sort of managing Gaza in an extended transition period until the Gazans both have the capability to manage themselves and are not seen by Israel as a threat. In all of this, Israel would want to maintain some kind of security corridor, not just in northern Gaza, but sort of wrapping all the way around, all right? Because again, people will forget that on October 7th, the invasion from Hamas wasn't just in northern Gaza. It was simultaneously in 29 different points, 22 different villages from northern, southern, and central Gaza. And so you need the corridor to go all the way around the strip. That's something that has to be negotiated. And Israel would still need to maintain some kind of ability to, if it had intelligence that somebody was going to perpetrate a terror attack, to go in, in a targeted way, not a full invasion with hundreds or thousands of troops, but some small force to go in and get the terrorists the same way Israel can do that in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria today. So that's sort of the less good or very complicated news about the future. Now, that's just Gaza, okay? And I just said to you, Gaza actually, with all of the horrible things that Hamas did and the huge amount of people that they killed, the 1,200 people they killed on October 7th, Hamas still is by far not the biggest threat. Add in that we've taken apart most of their collective ability to fight as an organized force. The much bigger threat, again, that's near threat, is Hezbollah. So what's been going on with Hezbollah? Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, the operation that they pulled off on October 7th was with Iranian planning, logistics, and funding, but they didn't get a specific order from Iran to do it on October 7th. Iran had been telling them, try to provoke, try to make trouble for a long time, but it wasn't, that specific day. Unlike with Hamas, Iran gave a specific order to Hezbollah on October 8th, immediately start shooting rockets and anti-tank missiles at Israel. There was an order given from Iran to Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a direct proxy of Iran. What's some of the difference between Hezbollah and Hamas? Hezbollah is Shiite. Iranians are Shiite. Hamas is Sunni. So in a sort of perfect world, these two would sort of be fighting themselves. the enemy of the enemy is my friend. So for the time being, for the last couple of years, Hamas and Iran have been cooperating against Israel. There was a time period where the two weren't talking. Hezbollah is a direct proxy from Iran, gets basically 100% of its directives funding from Iran. They were given an order on October 8th, start attacking, and they did. I don't have the latest numbers, but the last time we were given numbers on Hezbollah attacks, they had already fired rockets or anti-tank missiles over 2,000 times at Israel. I'm guessing at this point it's closer to 2,500 or 3,000 times. The bad news is Hezbollah started this war with 150,000 rockets and mortars. So if Hamas has, exhausted most of its rockets, or most of its rockets have either been exhausted or destroyed, again, they have enough that if they, only shoot occasionally in small numbers, they could probably keep going for a while, but their ability, they probably have only in the hundreds of rockets, so they need to really conserve. Hezbollah has 99% of its, arsenal is still there. What do we do with Hezbollah? Okay, good news about Hezbollah is I can report from classified sources that we have taken out about 75% of Hezbollah's Radwan, that's their special forces that were in southern Lebanon. And we have taken out about somewhere between 85 to 95% of the Radwan Hezbollah lookout post in southern Lebanon. So Israel has said that sort of its minimum in terms of returning about 80,000 Israeli residents on the northern border who have evacuated since October. Right? You have 80,000 Israelis who haven't been able to live in northern Israel. By the way, when we talk about sort of, a peace process and the 1967 borders, this isn't 1967 Israel. This is 1948 Israel. It's not the Golan Heights. This is a part of Israel that the whole world recognizes as part of Israel. There's no dispute. And 80,000 of those people from 1948 Israel have not been able to live in their homes for 3 months. Israel said, its minimal requirements to let them go back would be to expel Hezbollah Radwan forces from southern Lebanon, to have them not be south of what's called the Litani River. That's a rough estimate because the Litani River, if you look at it, at some point dips down. So some places they'd also have to be north of the Litani River. Say roughly speaking, people talk about the Litani River. So we're a large part of the way there, but we're not all the way there. And there's no sign that Hezbollah is going to necessarily agree to get all the way there. Also, Hezbollah has said they're not going to stop shooting until we have a ceasefire with Gaza. So we don't want the two fronts to be connected, but they are somewhat connected whether we like it or not. So that's what's going on with that. Our hope is that we'll be able to, intimidate them, deter them, convince them to keep their forces, north of the Litani. If not, there is a real potential that Israel might have a much larger war with Hezbollah in the future. Another possibility that I was told that I wrote an exclusive about in the last couple of days is that maybe even if Hezbollah wasn't deterred before, now when they see what we've done to Gaza, and if we've pushed 75% of their forces north, and if we double the number of Israeli troops on the northern border from 1 division to 2 full divisions, maybe that would be enough to let the northern residents come back, even if not all of the Hezbollah fighters, terrorists, whatever you want to call them, have gone to the Litani River. Maybe that mix would be enough. Nobody's saying that out loud because that would be politically very unpopular with the northern residents. I'm going to move on to my book and use that to sort of talk about Iran for about 10 minutes, and then we'll do questions. So before I get into the substance of the book, I will say, and I'm quoting Publishers Weekly and other reviewers, that it reads like a fiction thriller, very fast-paced, except that it's true. Okay, this book, I was very lucky to get access to a number of Mossad chiefs, a number of Mossad agents, a number of CIA people, top officials in the US, in Israel. And it's telling a story about things that basically just happened. Anybody who reads Mossad and CIA books normally, you would know that it's about things that happened 50 years ago, maybe if you're lucky, 25 years ago. because that's how long it takes to declassify these operations. And I was very lucky to be able to get sources who were talking about operations that happen in 2023, many operations in 2022, and about 70% of the book comes from 2018 and 2020 and forward. So we're talking about things that happened in the last, 3 years, 5 years. That's most of the book. Basically unprecedented to be able to put this out. How was I able to put it out? So some of it I was able to penetrate sources. Some of it is, people might remember in 2018 that Israel seized Iran's secret nuclear archives from under its nose. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu decided to make that operation public and disclosed it to the world about 3 months later. And when he did that, that made it a little bit easier to get closer to some of the officials who were involved, and then to be able to tell the story about some of the other operations. So it is a very unique book in terms of it's both fun, but it's both true and very, very current. This is the first book that is telling the story of Yossi Cohen. Yossi Cohen was the Mossad chief from 2016 to mid-2021. It's the first book to tell the story of the current Mossad chief, David Barnea. So this is introducing those characters to the world. Now that's sort of all like why, even if you're somebody who doesn't love policy, why you might love this book, but there are some very serious policy implications to the book. That's one of the reasons I want to talk about it here and connect it to the war. I'll come back to my initial point. All of this has to do with Iran. Hamas could not have pulled off what they did on October 7th without Iran. The sophisticated tunnels that they did, they couldn't have done without Iran. Hezbollah got huge amounts of its, rockets, all of its funding from Iran, and are taking direct orders from Iran. People might have heard about that there was an attack on a US base in Jordan recently. All right, how did the very unsophisticated little militias, Iranian militias in Iraq, pull this off? Because Iran trained them to be able to do surveillance and follow US drones, and they sent a drone, an attack drone, that went along with the US drone and followed it back to the base so that it had basically no separate radar signature, and that's how they were able to beat US defenses. That is a sophisticated move of Iran training unsophisticated militias in Iraq. All of the shipping problems that are going on worldwide now because the Houthis in Yemen are attacking international shipping. They would not exist. They would not have any kinds of the rockets or power that they have without Iran. So Iran is this global problem. And we discussed that in the book. In the book, we talk maybe most importantly about the nuclear threat. Now, people have probably heard the phrase JCPOA. That's the acronym for the Iran nuclear deal from 2015. And what was good about the deal is Iran gave away the nuclear enrichment, the enriched uranium that it had at the point, and it reduced the amount of uranium that it had, and it shut off a lot of its centrifuges. The bad thing was it never sort of made it impossible for Iran to rebuild all of that. It didn't address Iran's terrorism. It turned out that Iran had hidden huge amounts of its nuclear program from the IAEA, the UN nuclear inspectors. That's what we found out when the Mossad got all of those documents in 2018, that Iran was in fact moving documents all over the place to hide them, 2 years after they signed the deal that they were going to open everything. Now, whether there should be or shouldn't be a negotiated deal with Iran to return them into the deal to sort of push off the problem or not, the fact is that October 2025, right, remember that date, October 2025, even if they went back into the JCPOA, this Iran nuclear deal, the limits on their centrifuges, those are the machines that move really fast, which enrich uranium, expire. Now, people will say to me, wait a second, I thought I heard that the deal only expires in 2030, 2031. Technically speaking, the whole deal only expires then. But put it like this, let's say Iran only has zero enriched uranium in 2025. If the limits on their centrifuges come off, then even if they're starting with zero, they can get enough for a full nuclear weapon or multiple nuclear weapons in days or maybe weeks in a time that would be too short for us to detect. So really the next crisis point, whether anyone gets back into an Iran nuclear deal or not, and right now it looks like there wouldn't be, But even if they did, October 2025 is a built-in crisis. We talk about the implications of that in the book so that you can fully understand it. The last part of the book, which does relate back to the Gaza war and the day after, I'll tie it all together. Everybody knows that the Mossad is awesome at assassinations, at hacking, at sabotage, but people don't think of the Mossad as a peacemaking organization. And yet it is. And this is, by the way, I think when we got Simon & Schuster, one of the top publishers in the United States, I think that's what spoke to them the most, was that the Mossad was making peace normalization behind the scenes for years with the UAE, with Bahrain, and most importantly with the Saudis. Right? The fact that the Saudis haven't signed on the dotted line yet, the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco would never have made the deals that they did without Saudi permission, without a Saudi blessing. So all of the stars need to align. The Saudis need some kind of larger concession from Israel towards the Palestinians for them to sign on the dotted line. But if you go back just 2 weeks before October 7th, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who really has been running the country for many years, he said, we're weeks away from a deal. So if October 7th hadn't happened, there probably already would have been normalization. That's still the direction that they want to go in. Now, again, it's more complicated now because of the situation in Gaza, and the Saudis understand that their public is madder at Israel than ever before because of what they're seeing in their videos, and they don't know all of the factual context. But the Saudis still see their interest in the long term as being aligned with Israel to help protect them from Iran. We talk about in the book, there is already, since at least 2022, maybe earlier, a Middle East regional missile defense where the Saudis and the UAE and Bahrain and other countries and Israel are all sharing operational intelligence. They have used operational intelligence to help each other shoot down drones that were going to attack Sunni countries. Israel's helped them to shoot down those drones, and the Sunni countries have given Israel intelligence to help shoot down Iranian drones, which were coming to attack Israel. That has already happened. So all of that is in the book, and the backstory of how Yossi Cohen and Meir Dagan and other Mossad officials put the Abraham Accords together before it was finalized. You can get that exclusive story there. Again, if we bring it all back, what we hope, if we're being optimistic, if we're being pessimistic, things are going to be a mess for a very long time. If we're being optimistic, it is possible that this war that Hamas started gave us the ability to finally remove them from the table. They were the single largest obstacle to a larger regional peace. And if Hamas is removed out of the way, if Gaza can be stabilized, it is theoretically possible that there could be some move forward diplomatically with the Palestinians, and at the same time, getting a broad deal with the Saudis. And if the Saudis come in, you get maybe another 5 or 10 Arab and Muslim countries which normalize with Israel. So at the end of this, we're talking long term, not in the next year or so. At the end of this, Israel could come out ahead, more secure than ever, with an ability to use alliances with other Sunni countries to focus on the real enemy, Iran, and their proxies such as Hezbollah and the Houthis. I'm happy to take questions.
Yonah, thank you so much. Before we go to questions, we do a 1-minute promo, which starts now. As we do each week, at the end of the event, if there's anyone here who is not yet actively supporting AJA, please go to the website, which is jewishassociation.org.au, where you can subscribe to the email list, hopefully make a contribution, be a supporter. Make sure you're following us on the various social media for multiple updates every day of the latest news and views. I've put there the link to Yonah's book that he's been talking about. Perhaps the easiest thing to do is to go to Amazon where it's for sale and just do a search on Target Tehran or his name, and I'm sure it'll come up. Now, next week we have a bit of a first. Our guest next week is the new president of the Rabbinic Council of Australia, Rabbi Nochem Shapiro. Community advocacy is very important. AJA has been concerned that the rabbinate, frankly, has not always been pulling its weight. We do need our values articulated Clearly, AJA is very happy to lead in the political space, and we look at working with the rabbinate a bit more closely on certain other issues. And Malcolm Shapiro seems to be a person who will speak out, who's confronted government inquiries, and we even put him on Sky News recently, where he did very well. So, Robert, if you'd like to jump in and manage question time, that would be great.
Sure, and the link to the book is also in the chat. We've posted it a couple of times. All right, for questions, I think we've got a lot of questions, so we'll go to some new people maybe today that haven't asked before. To Greg, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, Robert. Thanks very much, and hello, Yonah. I was very interested when you were talking about alliances with other Islamic countries. I do a bit of work and understand that the constitutions of each of these Islamic countries all revert down to the Quran, revert down to Sharia, revert down to Allah. And all the doctrine that is the foundation of those constitutions.
Greg, I just got to remind everyone to just go straight to your question. We don't have we've got a whole list of people here, and we don't have time for little talks. So just your question, Greg.
So yeah, the Quran's all about killing the Jews. How can Israel have confidence in being able to trust the companies they're sharing intelligence with?
Okay, thank you for the question. Listen, this is a complex question. Can you normalize or make, long-term ceasefires or peace, whatever you want to call it, with people who that even as they're signing the documents, they probably would rather that you be in the Mediterranean Sea and not in the Middle East, and certainly not anywhere near, what they consider their holy land that's not ours. So what I would say is we now have 6 agreements with Muslim Arab countries: Egypt, Jordan, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. The Egypt peace deal has lasted now for 45 years, including for a year and a half when the Muslim Brotherhood was running the country, the radical terrorist Muslim Brotherhood, and they still decided that it wasn't in their interest to repeal the peace deal. Jordan has been going, for over 25 years. All of the 4 Abraham Accords countries have not stepped away from the deal, even though we're bombing like crazy in Gaza, and they're getting all of these videos of what's happening to their brethren. So what I would say is, it's not a matter of trusting them. I don't think we need to trust anybody. I think the IDF, no matter how many peace deals we have, will need to remain the most powerful military in the region. We will need to make sure that the United States gives Israel higher quality weapons than any of these other countries, so that we're always a step ahead of them, should any of them ever change their mind and get the wrong idea that they can actually try and defeat us. But the purpose is, even if they hate us, if they're not willing to shoot at us, and they're not willing to shoot at us for 50 years, that's worth pursuing so that we don't have to fight wars with them. I think I'd keep it as narrow as that. It's not about trust. The IDF will have to stay strong, but if we can avoid fighting, Egypt was a much bigger threat than anybody we faced until now. We haven't had to fight them for, this long. That's worthwhile pursuing.
Okay, next we'll go to Solomon. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry about that. I'm just trying to come back to the question. Where are we? Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you, David. When or why should Israel move from the 2 mandatory conditions for ceasefire? That is, 1, return all hostages; 2, for Hamas to unconditionally lay down and surrender all their arms. Why should Israel be always giving when Hamas took so much from us on October 7th?
Okay, I'm going to give you my personal opinion, and then I'm going to tell you what I think the government is going to do. My personal opinion is I think that the risk to Israelis of letting Hamas leadership, stay alive, living Israelis and future Israelis who haven't been born is too great. And I wouldn't do that under any circumstances. I would go in and try to save as many hostages as possible, but make sure that we got the leadership of Hamas. That's my personal opinion. The government, again, I gave sort of the two sort of sides of the government, is not in that position. I'll try to explain the way that they think, and the way that the majority of Israelis think is the army is a draft army. It's not voluntary. People are forced into the army by the draft. And so there's sort of a social contract that anybody who's in the army, Israel will do anything it can to get them back, because they were put in danger, not because they chose to be, but because the country sort of forced them to be in the draft. And so that is a way that Israelis think about getting back their soldiers. If you remember the Gilad Shalit deal from 2011, Israel gave 1,000 prisoners, basically for one guy. It made no logical sense. And a lot of Israelis afterwards were like, well, we'll never do that again. Guess what? Now that there were a certain number of hostages, all the people said we'd never do it again, changed their mind. It's not a logical, rational issue. It's a deep, emotional, social contract issue. And I would say it's even deeper for the civilians who are in the South. The idea that civilians were kidnapped on Israeli soil, the idea that they need to be brought back no matter the cost, that's sort of how they're approaching it. I do think, again, my hope is that they will not step down from at least the condition of expelling the Hamas leadership. If they expel the Hamas leadership, then even if they don't kill them, it will be much harder for Hamas to come back in Gaza. If they allow the Hamas leadership, Sinwar, Deif, Sinwar's brother, Isa, to remain in Gaza, I would be very, very worried about Hamas's ability to return, not necessarily to the same power in a short time, but even if it took them 5 years after what we saw, I don't want them to come back in 5 years. I don't want to give them that opportunity. So I hope that at least the Israeli leadership will insist that before it completely ends the war, temporary ceasefire, I don't have a problem with, but I hope before they are completely ready to cease the war and pull troops out, that at the minimum, they'll insist that the Hamas leadership be expelled. I hope.
Hey, Ellen, would you like to ask your question?
Is there a question?
Yes. Yonah, you spent quite a bit of time outlining how many different organizations might be brought in to look after Gaza the day after. You didn't mention Israel. Why is there any reason that Israel can't do its own job there? It's the only one that's reliable. There's always a leak when they try with other people. That's one question. And a very quick second question. Would it not be a good idea for Israel to stop taking hostages, to stop taking prisoners? That, in my opinion, an alternative would be to return minor offenders back to their country and the death penalty for major ones. If we didn't have any prisoners, there may be less incentive to take hostages.
Okay, so the first question was, why doesn't Israel just keep control of Gaza and manage Gaza? So I'll just say there is a group of politicians in Israel who are in favor of that. That would be Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich of the National Religious Party and the Otzma Yehudit party. They are not decision makers within the government, right? The main decision makers are Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, Yuval Galant, the defense minister, Gadi Eisenkot, These are sort of the main decision makers. Those people they probably have three different views on what should be in the day after, and the Palestinian Authority, and whether to go to war with Hezbollah or not. But on the issue of whether Israel should control Gaza, manage Gaza long term, all of them agree not. Why not? Basically, what they would say is that at the end of the day, what Israel wants is its security taken care of. And if Israel can take care of its security by having a security zone along the whole strip, and by maintaining the right to be able to go in at any time to destroy or kill terrorists, that would be sufficient. Whereas having to run the lives of these people, and that would mean Israel would also be responsible for the bill for 2.3 million people, would extremely harm Israel's economy for decades. And in terms of the world support, there's countries where their support matters a little bit, it matters not a little bit. The United States matters a lot. Israel could not even have fought the war the way that it did without constant resupply of military munitions from the United States. The United States would not accept this under any circumstances. We would be cut off from military support. The relationship between the United States and Israel diplomatically and economically might also change. Though I think the economic risks, the diplomatic risks are higher than the benefit that we might have in terms of security if we think that we could mostly handle the security issue with the security zone and the ability to go back in again. Is that a perfect answer? No. But again, it's security isn't a zero sum. There are other elements that come into play, and at some point, your economy and your relationship with countries like the United States impacts security itself. You also had the question, I'm sorry, about the death penalty. I think a lot of people actually think what you said today more than thought before the war. I think before the war, there just weren't, the Israeli public as a whole overwhelmingly was against the death penalty. I think a lot more are in favor of the death penalty now. It might happen. The death penalty might be widened. I don't think they're going to do it right now because they're trying to get Israeli hostages back. But you might see whenever the Israeli hostages are back, or whenever that chapter ends, however it ends, there might be a change in Israeli law about death penalty for terrorists. You might see that. I can't say for sure, but there are more people who think that way today than before.
Hey, Alan, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yonah, when the war started, we learned how America is controlling supply of munitions to Israel. Some might say rationing. How and why did Israel get into such a situation? And can this be changed for the future?
Okay, so what we need to say here is it is possible. Israel could exist militarily without military support from the United States. But you're talking about probably a 5 to 10 year process of creating new industries, changing industries, before Israel would get to the point that it could produce all of the things that it needs to just in Israel. We're talking about a 5 to 10 year process. It's not something that you can, snap your fingers. When you're talking about producing an aircraft like the F-35, it's something that can take 10 or 15 years. Certain kinds of, advanced tanks takes a very long time. So these are not things that could happen overnight. There are some people who say Israel should move more in that direction so it is less reliant on the United States. What I would say is the support that Israel gets from the United States, militarily, diplomatically, economically, is a unbelievable help to Israel in the security zone. Does it sometimes come with sacrifices? Yes. But I would not give that up because it's not just that the United States vetoes things at the UN Security Council. It's not just the money and the military. It's also that Iran itself, Hezbollah itself, think harder about attacking Israel because they know that Israel has the backing of the United States. So I would just be I'm not saying that it might not be smart to develop some of those industries more in Israel so that Israel is less reliant on the United States. but I would be very careful about undermining that relationship because it has very powerful security implications that can't always be quantified.
I'd also add, Yonah, that we've heard people talk that the US actually gets a lot of benefit out of the relationship as well. I mean, there is sharing of technology, the sharing of real life conflict experience where various things are tested, and there is probably no country in the world better than Israel who tests the high-tech military aspect. And I have a cousin who's involved in the Israeli military technology and engineer, and part of his role is to share Israel's advances with the US. That's part of his roles.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of the major US technologies really get tested in Israel, and that's how they know how they work, how they don't work, how to troubleshoot. And that's just technology. I mean, in intelligence, if anybody who gets the book, you'll see the amount of penetration that the Mossad has in Iran is incredible. And the United States doesn't have that level of penetration. So the intelligence that Israel provides the United States about Iran and what's going on in the Middle East is invaluable. It's not something they could get anywhere else.
Okay, next question. Got my good friend in.
Me, Hazel. We all know about the pressure that's been put on Israel to minimize casualties and to respond proportionately, blah, blah, blah. So to what extent is this pressure actually impacting on the IDF's operations in Gaza? And how differently would the IDF operate if they didn't have this pressure, as most other armies generally don't?
It's a great question. So there have been two major elements that have sometimes limited what the IDF would do in Gaza. The larger one is actually the Israeli hostages. I can tell you that there are times where the IDF has known that they might have been able to get certain top Hamas people, but they knew that they had hostages around them as human shields, and they let them flee because they were not willing to target them and kill the hostages. I can tell you it's probably happened a lot more than once. So that, I think, has been a larger limitation. There have been some limitations in fighting against, Hamas forces, Hamas terrorists, because of Palestinian civilians. There have been times where Israel's called off attacks because of potential collateral damage to nearby civilians. Should Israel be more aggressive than it's been? What I would say is, I think that the vast majority of the time, Israel gets people that it needs to get. They've shown that they've been willing to go into hospitals, to go into mosques. They'll do it more carefully. I would say we might lose more Israeli soldiers sometimes because instead of bombing or airstriking, we're sending in our own soldiers. We have risk to force protection. What I would say is, you could be right that we might lose a smaller number of Israeli soldiers that way. But if we didn't follow these rules that are recognized as international law rules by the United States, Europe, Australia, most Western countries, that also could affect things strategically in the US relationship with those countries. So I have not seen yet a case where I thought that we gave up a target that we couldn't get at some other point, that it would be worth endangering the relationship with those countries, breaking those rules. Now you could say, well, people already say we're breaking the rules, but not the key countries. Okay, the United States, again, and key allies in the West recognize that Israel is actually following the international law rules. And that's why you'll see a number of the countries criticize the International Court of Justice for taking the genocide case, right? A lot of countries criticize that. That matters to us more than what the ICJ says. The fact that the United States and European countries and other Western countries continue to say Israel is a moral army, even if they criticize and they say, well, we'd like you to cut the civilian casualties down more, they're not saying that Israel has committed war crimes. And that's an important thing in terms of the strategic alliance. I understand that it does hurt sometimes to be risking some of our soldiers' lives.
Okay. about 10 people with their hands up, but I think Ruvain's had his hand up the longest. So do you want to very quickly ask a question?
Thank you, Yonah. Yonah, when you started speaking, you brought up the issue of why Israel didn't go into the whole of Gaza and just concentrate on the north. Would you agree that it was the majority of missiles being fired from the north to get rid of those first? And point A and point B, Israel had to be on standby in case Hezbollah would start firing saturated rockets in the north and have troops available to be able to counter that.
Okay, so we're coming back to why did Israel go into the north first and sort of not really go into the south until early December? Basically, there was a hope that when Hamas's leadership saw what Israel did to northern Gaza, and having been in northern Gaza myself, I can tell you there basically isn't northern Gaza. When people say, well, you have to let the Palestinian civilians go back to northern Gaza, there's nothing to go back to. It's not like the other operations where half of the street got bombed, half of the street didn't. There is no street. There is no, water pipes. There's no infrastructure. There's no neighborhood. It's flat. So Palestinian civilians will not be able to go back for 5 years. They were hoping that they showed that picture to Hamas's leadership, and then they said, make the deal with us, get expelled, or we're going to do that to you in Khan Yunis in the south, that they wouldn't have to go into the south, and there would already be a deal. That's what they were hoping. It didn't come out that way, but that's what they were hoping. Was that sort of a pipe dream, or was it a real possibility? It's, nobody completely understands the psychology of a psychopath like Sinwar, who ordered what he ordered on October 7th. In terms of northern Lebanon, the north and Lebanon and Hezbollah, I can tell you that there are, probably more than 2 divisions on the border right now, that there are probably more Israeli aircraft on standby in the north than there are in the south. And that one of the reasons that people said that Israel delayed its invasion, you might remember that Israel took about 3 weeks after October 7th before it invaded even northern Gaza. And myself and other people said, go in faster. One of the reasons they said we want to have the full forces ready on the border with Hezbollah, so that if Hezbollah starts a war once we invade Gaza, we will have as strong or stronger forces in the north than we have in the south. So they're absolutely still at that very high point of readiness. If Israel decided that it wanted to start a war with Hezbollah tomorrow, or if Hezbollah made the mistake to start a war today, Israel would be ready. Again, they may not decide to do that because Hezbollah has such a large rocket arsenal that even though Israel would win, the damage that Hezbollah could do to Israel's home front is dramatically way more than what Hamas was able to do.
Okay, last very brief question. Dina, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Just following on from the earlier point about the day after, if an international consortium was installed to control Gaza and things went bad, how do you see Israel managing to respond to that if, for example, the US was involved or UK?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and this is why top Israeli officials have not been rushing to this day after. I think the 2-point answer is, number one, that over the next 9 months or year and a half, they want to kill and arrest as many of the Hamas forces that they haven't gotten to yet, right? There isn't a collective Hamas army anymore. That's been taken apart. But there are still, maybe as many as 40% of their forces faded into the civilian population here, there, and elsewhere. And over time, when those people come out to try to do an ambush, each time we can kill another 5, another 10, that adds up. Maybe we can get rid of 80% of their forces or 90% of their forces before we hand it over to this hybrid of other countries and other entities. But number 2, that's where we keep the security zone. The security zone means that we'll have forces in the north, center, and south of Gaza that can already, within minutes or certainly hours, penetrate to wherever they need to get to without having to mount a large invasion, without having to call up reservists. they should, from those close spots, be able to get in fast, so that even if there's a security problem, they should be able to get control of it, even if it's been managed and handed over to the United States, to the EU, to the Arab, allied countries. Now, at some point, might those countries say, okay, now you have to withdraw. It's been 3 years, it's been 5 years, you have to withdraw from that security zone. That'll be a later negotiation. Has Gaza really moved to a point where their whole character has changed in only 3 years or 5 years? Or will Israel say, look, we'll hand over Gaza, but we're keeping the security zone for 10 years or 20 years to see, a whole new generation, a real changeover maybe, to have taken place.
Okay, what a very informative talk. See, we've got so many questions still people want to ask. So thank you so much, Yonah. I'm going to post your book again in the chat so that everyone can go out and buy it. I think they should. And if people want to keep up to date with your work, what's the best way? Is that just through the Jerusalem Post? Or?
Yeah, the Jerusalem Post. I write there every day. I can send Robert also my link to my author page, so that if somebody specifically wants to read me, you can just click on that link and you'll get my most recent articles. But yeah, the Jerusalem Post would be the way to follow. And the book, if anybody, I don't know exactly how orders work in different countries. If anybody has an issue with getting the book, I could see if I could help with a bulk order to Australia. But hopefully the Amazon link should work.
It will.
Well, we'll let all of those who are joining us as well, who are listening to the replay or tomorrow, who aren't in the chat. His book is Target Tehran, and that is available, Target Tehran, that is available on Amazon and our local Australian Booktopia. So it is available on the Australian supplier. So anyone who wants to purchase that, it is available now. All right, thank you so much to everybody who's joined us tonight on Zoom, who's watching the Facebook Live. And we need to say thank yous to our listeners tomorrow who are listening to the replay on J-Air Community Radio. Please, this was such an incredible, informative talk, and this is information that needs to be listened to, shared, and between family, friends, and everybody you know. We will have this recording on our AJA YouTube channel as well as on our Facebook page. Please share this around. I could listen to you for another hour. This was really special for us and an incredible talk. Really, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And again, have a wonderful evening, everybody. Thank you. And we'll see you next week when we welcome Rabbi Shapiro.
Thank you.